This is Comic Shenanigans, episode 1078, a conversation with Ron Frenz, creator commentary on Spider-Man Revenge of the Green Goblin.
Ain't no stopping them shenanigans. Love getting into shenanigans. All up in them shenanigans. 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 Shenanigans.
Welcome to the Comic Shenanigans podcast. This is episode 1078. It's another Ron Frenz episode. He's a great friend of the show. He's back this time to talk about his work on Revenge of the Green Goblin, which was a miniseries in the early 2000s that he worked on with Roger Stern, which is obviously someone who's a Spider-Man luminary, and so they worked on a miniseries, which unfortunately seems to be somewhat forgotten. We actually get into the episode of kind of why that might be, that there was kind of some weird things happening in the Spider books at the time, which kind of undercut the story that Ron and Roger were telling in Spider-Man Revenge of the Green Goblin. But it's always fun to talk with Ron. This is yet another great conversation. If you want to look at the back catalog, the first time Ron, was on the show was, oh my goodness, way back 10 years ago in August 2015 in episode 296. Then he returned for episode 408, which would have been about a year later. Then probably the longest time he spent not on the show, 3 years later, he was on episode 734. Then he was back for 744, 748, 776, 886, 920, 980, 1004, 1041, 1052, and now and also 1067. So he's a regular occurrence here. It's always a pleasure to have Ron back on the show. We really get into this miniseries. If you want to email me, you can do so at comicshenanigans@gmail.com. You can rate the show on Apple Podcasts, listen to us on Apple Podcasts, and also listen to us on Spotify. Some great episodes coming up in the future. We've got a great Book of the Month club for Valentine's Day coming up. We also have upcoming episodes with Ron Mars, as well as Judd Winnick, and a few others, and some surprises and new guests. So some exciting new stuff coming up in the next month or two. Make sure that you have Comic Shenanigans, part of your subscriptions. Wherever you follow podcasts, make sure you subscribe so you get all the newest episodes. Thank you so much for listening. Let's get right into the conversation with Ron Frenz. Enjoy. Ron, welcome back to the Comic Shenanigans podcast.
Adam, it is always a pleasure to hang out with you and to talk about my favorite subject, which is, I guess, me, or my work anyway. So it makes me feel special. But it's always a pleasure, sir.
It is, well, the pleasure's all mine. I think I've lost track. I think this is the 15th time that we've had you on. I guess I should stop counting. It's just such a pleasure every time.
Wow.
Today's an interesting one because last time we talked about your Hercules miniseries with Tom DeFalco in the late 90s. And right near the end of the conversation, we kind of segued into talking about Revenge of the Green Goblin, which is what we're going to talk about today, or I guess technically Spider-Man Revenge of the Green Goblin, issues 1 to 3. And you told a little bit of a story, but for those who didn't catch that interview, how did you end up on this project? Because it was a bit of a rush job from what I remember from our previous conversation.
It was a bit more than a bit of a rush job. It was a very unusual assignment. What ended up happening is the gentleman that was scheduled to do it, and there's no reason not to mention him because he's a fantastic craftsman, Mr. Lee Weeks, had just done a miniseries, I believe, for the same editor, certainly for the Spider-Man office. It was called the Mysterio Manifesto, I believe, or something.
Yes, that's right.
I think Tom DeFalco even wrote it, didn't he, or worked on it to some degree. Mm-hmm. Anyway, Lee was supposed to do it. He did the first cover, and he was scheduled to do this series. Now, I don't know what happened. I have met Lee a few times. He is an incredible gentleman and a consummate professional, so I have no idea what might have come up whether it was a personal issue or professional scheduling or what it was. But for some reason, perfectly legitimate, I'm sure, no matter how unfortunate for editor Ralph Macchio anyway, he had to bow out of the project at the 11th hour. Okay. And of course I had a professional relationship with Ralph Macchio. He was my editor on Thor and Thunderstrike and many other projects. And so it was some situation where I don't know whether he approached me because I'm known to be fast when I have to be, or exactly what the order of contact was, other than it was at a point when I think I was still sharing office space with Pat Olive. I think I was still in the studio with Pat. Mm-hmm. But whether we were still sharing space or not, it was Pat's willingness to jump on board as the finisher on the project that emboldened me to say, I think we can help you, Ralph. And we were talking about, I mean, when we took the job, we knew what was necessary was to produce virtually an issue a week.
Wow.
22 pages of pencils and inks in like a week and a half each to get the 3 issues done and ready to ship, because they had already been solicited and everything, you know. So when I say Mr. Weeks had to bow out at the 11th hour, it was the 11th hour or the 12th hour or whatever you want to call it. So it was a very unfortunate situation for monthly comics publication, but it was what it was, and Pat thought we could do it. He thought he could do it. I thought we could be able to pull it off. So we both kind of looked at each other and said, you know, how could it be a bad thing to ingratiate ourselves to Ralph Macchio, who at that point was the editor on the Spider-Man titles? Mm-hmm. How could that be a bad thing? And so we kind of, you know, shook hands and decided, let's give this a shot. So that's what we were doing. We set out to produce 22 pages of comic book art every week and a half or so for the next 3.5, 4 weeks, you know, that kind of thing. Wow. And we set out to do it. Because of that, of course, I don't even have pencil Xeroxes of most of the issues, because the pages were just, you know, going right to Pat. With no time to run to Kinko's and make full-size Xeroxes or make Xeroxes of any kind, really. We were sending inked pages into the office as quickly as possible. It was also an opportunity, quite honestly, to work with Ralph, with Ralph again, of course, but with Roger Stern as the writer. And Roger personally is one of my favorite people, and he's also one of my favorite writers as a fan. And you know, doing a Spider-Man project with Roger was part of it too, part of the allure. Mm-hmm. Having done Hobgoblin Lives with him and everything, you know, and being associated with the Spider-Man project that Roger Stern was doing was okay by me. So there you go.
I have a lot of questions that pop up in this. I guess the first is when you guys decide to do this, because I guess I'm thinking of timeline. I think Pat was still working on Spider-Girl at the time, so this would have been kind of wedged in between the cracks of working on that project as well. Is this the fastest turnaround you've ever had to work on for this many issues in a row?
I think for 3 issues and a project beginning to end like this, I would say it probably is. I've probably turned around faster. I think my record was an issue of Star Wars. In fact, it was my final issue as the regular artist on Star Wars. Mm-hmm. I did 10 pages of layouts in a day. And that had a lot to do with the fact that it was Luke Skywalker on a platform floating on the ocean with a lot of clouds in the background, and some other characters moving around, and it was breakdowns in that I was not spotting blacks, and so it was a looser arrangement of the actual pencil work, and so that for some reason that sticks in my brain as being the fastest I ever turned pages around. But this certainly is on the list somewhere. Yeah, I don't know how it broke down per day or anything. Mm-hmm. But Pat and I worked we did a couple of jobs together, and we did the Hercules job together that you and I had just spoken about and everything. So it was one of those things where I tended to work in the evenings, being a bachelor, and he tended to work regular hours during the day, being married, and I don't know whether his child had been born yet or not. Probably not, but I don't really remember. But I was doing pages and either leaving him for him at the studio or dropping them off on his porch so he could, work on them the next day, and I went on to the next batch, that kind of thing. So, it happened. Somehow we put it together, and he and I have spoken about it since, and it's not our worst work. I mean, it's a work that we can both look at with a certain amount of satisfaction and contentment. So sometimes it's funny how those things play out. I mean, you would think, given the parameters, that it would probably be a job that neither one of us would really want to revisit or talk about too much or be all that proud of, but that's really not the case. So,
What's interesting in terms of the timeline, looking at least publication dates. I mean, who really knows with some of this stuff, but we're talking about 2000. So in that year, you're doing the 2 issues of Web Spinners that you did. Then you have the Buzz miniseries coming out throughout the summer. And then October, November, December is when Revenge of the Green Goblin actually ships. And at the same time it's coming out, you have the Dark Devil miniseries coming out at the same time. So you definitely were doing a fair bit. And then this is a very compressed publication schedule that you had to put out with Revenge of the Green Goblin. So you were quite busy.
Yeah, I have no recollection of how any of that stuff interacts. I'm terrible at that. But what it did come down, I remember it being, a compelling motivation was the idea of possibly getting, back on some Spider-Man work with Ralph Macchio. So I know that was in the consideration there somewhere. And Buzz, we were hoping was going to go to series, but it never really did. That was only 3 issues. Dark Devil was only 3 issues. So it was, I was probably looking for something along the lines of job security in this whole mix somewhere. But yeah, I mean, everything has worked out just wonderfully. But the early 2000s were not the most stable time in my professional career. Coming off of the end of the A-Next run and all that kind of stuff. I mean, it was an interesting, kind of frightening time to be a freelancer, because I wasn't sure from month to month what my relationship with Marvel was going to be going forward. So.
And it is interesting because I looking in hindsight, people can say, well, Ron had that big long run on Spider-Girl, and I'm like, yeah, but it was under cancellation threat all the time.
Oh, yeah.
There was no such thing as job security on Spider-Girl. I mean, thankfully it went on as long as it did, but it was you always read about how it was about to be canceled.
It was always about to be canceled. The closest we came to job security didn't last, because when we first started doing the digests, we were told by Marvel that as long as the digests were selling incredibly well at Scholastic book fairs and things like that, and was bringing in a new audience too. It was really kind of hitting our target demographic of school-aged kids and girls. I mean, it was really we were doing land office business, and the publishers were very, very happy, and they knew, if for no other reason than to feed the digests, we were told to expect to continue producing Spider-Girl work, right?
Mm-hmm.
And, so we were like, wow, okay, well, here we are then. This is kind of the most stable ground we've ever been on with Spider-Girl. And then Scholastic wanted a bigger cut because they were happy with the sales too. And Marvel said, no, forget it. And they stopped publishing the digest, and suddenly, that illusion of security just went away. So,
When you get brought on the project, and as you said, it's the 12th hour. It's too late to think about anything. At that point, I would imagine the script is the plot is fairly locked. How do you recall how in depth it was from Roger? Because Roger obviously comes from a different school, like an older school, and can do more plot style. Was this because
he's a tight plotter? Roger's always been a tight plotter. He sends you all the reference you could possibly want. If there's a single panel or pages of flashback, he will send you the Xerox copies, black and white Xerox copies of all of the reference you could possibly need for the flashbacks, all of the reference you would possibly need for any other characters that appear, in the course of this story. Osborn's assistant Mencken appears. And, there are other people from Oscorp that appear and stuff that he is on top of things. He has a background as an editor himself, and he takes complete responsibility for the story he's trying to tell. So, you can always count on getting, copious reference and all the information you could possibly need from Roger working on a story with him. And he's a very, when I say tight plotter, I mean, he structures the plot exactly the same way as everybody else does. I don't think he breaks down every single page, but it's similar in its looseness to what a Tom DeFalco would do, but it's all there. I mean, he has given thought to every part of the story. There's not a lot of space to have where a penciler would have to vogue or fill in the blanks or flesh out that scene or anything like that. Roger is very he's a very detailed, competent writer, and it makes it a lot of fun to work on because he doesn't in any way dictate angles or approach or direction, panel direction or anything, but he gives you everything you need to tell the story clearly. So.
One thing, actually, I should mention, and it was especially evident in these issues, but something I have noticed in general, that when you do flashback sequences, you always strive, and it's very noticeable, to really accurately capture the original moment, but then still do it in your style. And that seems like an obvious thing that people should do, but that's not what everyone does. But whereas there's some specific moments that you reference in, for example, the first issue, when you have Spider-Man fighting the Green Goblin, and they're referring to particular panel layouts from Final Chapter, and you are very specific, and you're doing exact moments, but again, it's still in your style. And I really appreciated that because it took me back to those moments because it didn't look different. It looked the same, but through your eyes. And so I really appreciated, and I do appreciate in general, how you're able to do that, because I don't think that's a skill that everyone can do, or maybe that just a discipline that not everyone employs.
It's a weird kind of, anytime somebody is able to unabashedly respect another illustrator's work, okay, whether it's in approach or whether it's in layout or whatever it is. It's an interesting kind of, I mean, I kind of see it as humility. I kind of see it as, this guy was paid to tell this story, and he did it very, very well, and all I'm doing is referring back to it. So I'm not trying to one-up him. I'm not trying to, show that it could have been done differently or better or anything. I'm just trying to take the cue for the storytelling purposes. And, yeah, I mean, as I flip through this first issue, when I talk about Roger supplying reference, the reference was copious. And I remember it involved I think there was an issue that Sal Buscema drew that was like inside Norman's head or something that showed some of his childhood, and I was sent some reference of that. The reference of what his father looked like, what his mother looked like, what some of their relationship dynamic was. Even the Green Goblin design was John Byrne's revamped Green Goblin design, and I think I was referencing some John Romita Jr. there in that final battle where he thought he brought down the Daily Bugle building, but really didn't. That kind of thing. And, so yeah, there was a lot of reference to the Gathering of the Five, and all the stuff that led up to where they were taking the point that they were taking Norman from. But the reference to his old family homestead, and on and on and on. So it was all credit to Roger, because he knows how to put that kind of stuff together so that you have everything you need right in front of you while you're working on it. So.
What I found really interesting in context was reading this 3-issue series, and then I didn't quite read the Amazing Spider-Man and Peter Parker Spider-Man issues that came right afterwards, but I kind of flipped through them, and it reminded me that, you guys, and we're obviously dictated to do this, we're using the John Byrne Green Goblin costume, and then the minute your series ends, it goes back to the traditional Green Goblin, and there's no discussion about it, there's no mention of it, and I'm curious because it feels like it was obviously an edict to you guys to use this costume, I would imagine, but then it's immediately not used in the successive storylines, so I'm just curious how you felt about that, or if you thought about that. Adam.
Have you since read the 2 issue 25s that this spun into?
Yes.
It has long been. I don't know how it happened. I have no idea. At that point, I was not regular on any title. My relationship with Ralph for this job, one of the things that Pat and I we're able to laugh about now, was that we entered into this arrangement partly because Ralph will owe us a favor. Maybe we get more Spider-Man work. Shortly after we completed this marathon, Ralph gave up the Spider-Man titles, and I don't know who took over from there, and I don't know whether a transition of editorial leadership had anything to do with this, but it has always been an issue with me. It's always kind of stuck in my craw that the 2 issue 25s that this led into had absolutely nothing to do with the 3 issues that Roger had put together and all of the story elements that he set up in it. It doesn't.
No,
it doesn't.
Yeah.
The miniseries ends with Peter Parker being surreptitiously programmed in very subtle, sinister ways to basically be Norman Osborn's what's the word I'm looking for?
Heir,
exactly. An heir to the Green Goblin, because at that point, Harry was dead, I believe, wasn't he? And all this kind of stuff, and that Peter Parker was going to be his, the only worthy heir to the Goblin legacy. And that's how we end the miniseries, was Peter being completely subsumed by this programming and, putting on the Goblin costume and all this kind of stuff. And yet you finish this miniseries and it leads you right into these anniversary issues of God knows what volume of Peter Parker and Spider-Man. And I picked, I flipped through them on the racks and I'm like, what is this? They didn't seem to have any bearing. They seemed to be working at almost cross purposes, but certainly it did not feel like it was like the writers of those 2 issues had read the miniseries or Roger's plots or anything. Because there was, I believe, it's been collected as a trade, and it's been a while since I've read all of it, because the trade collects both of those anniversary issues and the miniseries. And as I said, it's been a while since I've read it. But, you're right. The visual where they go back to the traditional Green Goblin is only half of it, because the stories don't line up either.
No, you're
It's
right. There's a lot of... It's almost as if it's like redoing some of the beats at the same time, but we've already seen it in the miniseries, and like you almost... This is the sad part, right? You could almost cut out the miniseries and it feel like you're not missing anything because they didn't build off any of the stuff you guys did, which is really sad because, like, you know, you introduced the new love interest for Norman Osborn and nothing ever happens with her because it's forgotten.
Right. Yep.
Like, it's just... Yep. It's really unfortunate.
That supporting character is gone. The dynamic of the programming is pretty much gone. And I don't understand it. I don't understand what the dynamic was where how any of that happened. I mean, it's not the first time, you know, that something like that has happened. I mean, where, you know, editorial, whether it's because of an editorial shift or whether it's because of some edict from outside the creative or whatever. I mean, you know, I've been part of projects before where, you know, you were a link in a chain and you were given certain parameters and you were told what the purpose of this story was, and then the people that pick it up after you go a completely different direction. I mean, that's certainly, I've witnessed it before. In this case, I have no idea what the backstory is on it. I don't know whether Ralph Macchio would remember. I don't know, you know, whether there was a reason for it or whether there was just everything was being worked on at the same time and there was a lack of a through line or an editorial connection or whatever the reason. You can read this 3-issue miniseries and then pick up the next issue, you know, the one of the anniversary issues, and say, okay, what happened? Where are these characters? What's going on? Why aren't we seeing Pete in the Goblin costume that was the last panel of the 3rd issue? You know, I don't know. I don't know.
It almost feels when you read it that like it's been rewound because it's like, oh, they haven't built to that crescendo yet, but like we already got that crescendo. Anyways, I won't belabor the point, but it is an odd reread because there is that disconnection. What I find is more interesting as well is that, you know, your series was very faithful to continuity and paying mention to a lot of different things and constructing its narrative and really using the bones of pre-existing continuity to go new directions. And it did feel like, as much as, you know, those anniversary issues may have been well written, there wasn't that sense of continuity in the same way, or the artifice wasn't being built up in the same way, because you guys were really building off the building blocks. I think the biggest one that people forget about, which Roger took a lot of time to explain and really build it into the plot, and everything he did with Norman, was the fact that Norman is crazier than ever because of the Gathering of Five, and so we need to figure out a mechanism to try and bring him a little bit more even-keeled, so because he's so crazy. He's out, like, just, if he was crazy before, he's even X amount of crazy now.
He has medication patches that keep him,
yeah,
you know, on the edge of sanity. Yeah, exactly.
Which again feels like, you know, Roger knows how to play in the sandbox and knows how to use what's around him to create the story. And then when you go into the Spider-Man issues proper, there's no mention of that. We don't get the sense that there's anything like that, and no one ever references it again, so it's almost like it didn't happen, which is unfortunate because that was, if you were reading comics at the time, the fact that he was extra crazy was a big deal. Like, you know, Norman's completely out to lunch. How are they going to deal with this going forward? And I guess the answer was they're not, but Roger dealt with it, which I thought was a really artful solution.
Well, with an indication of how much this sat with me for years is, and I don't know whether it's something that as a reader that you ever picked up on, or I wouldn't necessarily expect anybody to pick up on it. I've had conversations with other Spider-Girl fans, but when we at one point decided with Spider-Girl to bring Norman back without bringing Norman back, we picked up a bunch of threads from this story that I had worked on. I pitched it to Tom, and I said, listen, this was set up, and we never did anything about it. So we kind of picked up on some of the programming that was still left in Pete's head. We picked up on the Colina subplot that Norman had a relationship with this person, and we used that for continuing plot threads in Spider-Girl. And it was, I thought it was fair game, because it had been sitting out there at that point for years and years and years. And, and the way Tom structures a story, if people pick up on it, great, but if they don't, that's fine too. That kind of thing. Because when we finally told the backstory on the Black Tarantula in Spider-Girl, Tom and I put our heads together, and one of the suggestions that ended up being useful that I had made was tying it in to all this bizarre spider cult stuff that Straczynski had done. That this seemed to be kind of out of left field, and it seemed to be a new way to approach the Spider-Man character. But, it was there for the next writer to ignore or to pick up on or whatever. And, Tom had created Black Tarantula with a series of other illustrators on his second stint on Spider-Man. And, and when we decided to go into this backstory and decide what he was supposed to be, and and there was this sense that he was kind of like a dark version of the Phantom as far as, passing it down from father to son, and that was going to be some fun and everything. And I said, well, what if he's the Darth Vader of this whole spider cult thing? What if his origins and his power set and everything tie in to this whole Straczynski spider cult, and he's basically the foretold savior / Darth Vader of this whole thing, and again, Tom is such a skillful storyteller that he can tell his story, and if you make the connections, fantastic, and if you don't, the story is there to tell itself, and you can enjoy it for what it is. You don't need to know the backstory. You don't need to understand what you're connecting to necessarily, because it's all there in and of itself. But we did the same thing with Colina and with the programming and the whole idea of Pete being Norman's choice as his heir. All of that resurfaced in Spider-Girl, and it was very deliberate on my part to pick up on these story elements that nobody else did.
It's funny. I was before our conversation, I had looked up, other places that Colina had showed up, and in the 616, it took 23 years. She got a one-panel return out of nowhere about 2 years ago in a random miniseries about Venom and Carnage and that kind of stuff.
Really?
She had one brief moment. She has like one panel out of nowhere. And she's working for the cult of the Squires, and so she did show up eventually.
Huh. That's odd.
It was so odd. It was in Cult of Carnage, Misery #5. She has about 1 or 2 panels, and she says, "Summon the other Squires. You want something done right, you've got to do it yourself." And I don't think she ever showed up after that. So once again, she was the victim of a dangling plot.
Yeah, that poor woman.
Yeah, but I do have to appreciate, I don't know whose idea would have been to even use the character. I mean, that's a deep cut at this point. And so good on the writer or the editor to at least, try to add some other characters to the mix.
What's interesting now is anytime you're thinking about a story, I just had an experience with it myself where I was, I had come up with an idea that I was thinking about pitching to DeFalco to see if maybe we could pursue it as a mini series or some kind of a project. And you start doing your own research, and you look some stuff up on the internet, and you find some these thick, almost Wikipedia type entries of long histories of these characters and how they've been handled in the last 25, 30 years and all this. And it's a lot. I mean, I constantly on Facebook have people telling me, an example would be Thomas Firehart, Puma, boy, what they did to Puma. And I'm going, oh, really? What'd they do to Puma? And he goes, oh, don't ask. And then you go to Wikipedia or you go to a Marvel fan website, and you see that Puma has been used a little bit, and he showed up here and he showed up there, and he was a were Puma for a while and just an animal for a while, and all this kind of stuff, and it's like, okay. I just recently kind of went through something like that I thought it would be interesting to bring back the Thor Corps, because nobody's done anything with the original Thor Corps, which was Beta Ray Bill and Dargo Thor and Eric Masterson and Thor. And you could play with something with either Kang or the Tomorrow Man or any number of possibilities where you could even pull them out of different points in history and not have to deal too much with whatever the constant, whatever the current continuity or is for any of those characters. But as I did just started the barest research, I realized that they've been using the term Thor Corps quite often and quite regularly in the current Thor stories.
That's right.
They're using it for Grandpa Thor and King Thor and wow, boy, her name just went out of my head. His nurse.
Jane
Foster Thor and all this, but he's been using the term. He's called them Thor Corps, that kind of thing. And I'm like, well, then we're not really doing anything that's out of the past. We're not, because it's just something that it's a term that the current readers would be familiar with, and it's not its own thing anymore. That kind of thing. And that kind of took the wind out of that idea. And so it just. Yeah, I mean, there are so many of these ideas, so many die unborn, or wither on the vine because, while some ideas get picked up and run with, other ideas don't. I mean, I'm constantly reminding people on Facebook, I'll do a Thunderstrike post, and they'll say, boy, he never got his due. It was terrible that Marvel killed him. Marvel didn't kill him. Tom DeFalco and I, the idea was always set that Eric was not going to survive. We never thought it was going to happen as quickly as it did, especially once he was given his own strip,
Of course.
But Eric's epic was always meant to end a certain way. And, so it happened a lot sooner than we intended. But one of our concerns was we didn't really want him hanging around like poor Henry Pym did there for a while, where he was dressing like Doctor Who for a while and calling himself Dr. Pym, or he was wearing the red pajamas for a while, or he was, we were very concerned that Eric Masterson not just become Rick Jones or Snapper Carr, or even worse, Banana Man, that kind of thing, because some writer decided to just put him in tights again, that kind of thing. So, we didn't really want that to happen to him either. So, it was our call, it was our decision, that kind of thing. So, people tend to believe that that it must have been taken away from us, that it must have been forced on us or something. And I get it, because for a fan, it's hard to imagine that you would take your own character and make that tough of a call on your own character, that you'd want it to stay a part of the Marvel Universe for forever and ever and ever. And as a fan, I mean, they're not as privy to how the original creators might feel about how a character is used or abused over the decades, that kind of thing.
For sure. So,
I mean, when I find out that Thomas Fireheart got stuck through the ringer, I'm not thrilled about it, that kind of thing. I mean, and with writers like Roger Stern, as you pointed out, he is really good at using what has been established as fodder for new stories and to take things in new directions and all that. And ideally, that's what you want to do. But sometimes that means you have to really clean up some messes before you can move them in a positive direction, I mean, like if Tom DeFalco and I wanted to do something with Thomas Fireheart. If we wanted to do something with Puma now, we probably have to address at least some of what's happened to the poor guy.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, Tom's always in favor of, if you can get it done in a throwaway line, like, somebody says, "So what have you been doing, Thomas?" "I'd rather not talk about it." That can work too, but other times it takes some reclamation work, that kind of thing. But anyway, let's get back to Revenge of the Green Goblin. Do you have any other specific questions?
I do. I'm curious, just in general, how you felt about drawing the redesign of the Goblin as opposed to, the original Green Goblin costume.
Well, given that when I draw the Goblin on my own, I go all the way back to the Ditko design.
Mm-hmm.
That kind of gives you a sense of where my heart is. I didn't have any problem specifically with John Byrne's take on the character or anything. I didn't have to draw it a lot, but I did stay loyal to the new mask structure and the ears and all that kind of stuff, even as the story progressed, because we put him in some more ceremonial type robes and things like that. But it is what it is. I don't, as much as left to my own devices, I would go back to the original Ditko. I mean,
mm-hmm.
Byrne spent his time steering the character, and that's what we were left with. So you do your job, follow the reference. I don't understand why so many people have a problem with it. I have no idea how the guys who took over for me, how the John Romita Juniors and who was the gentleman that did the other 25?
It was Buckingham.
How they ended up going back to the original design, I have no idea. I don't know. Is Ralph Macchio still listed as the editor on those two projects?
He is, but it is around the time, now that you mention it, that Axel Alonso definitely... I mean, JMS comes in, I think, at issue 30, and Axel Alonso is the editor of the book at that time. So this is only 5 months prior, so it stands to reason that it was during that kind of transition period. So Ralph's still listed on the book, but it's possible that there was less going through him and maybe more through Axel.
I guess. Yeah, I mean, because I do remember that, Pat and I were a little crestfallen that Ralph was no longer going to be making those calls as mm-hmm. far as, that kind of thing. I mean, so Axel became the editor of record after Ralph's stint?
Yes, I definitely know that he was the one who was on board when JMS started his run. Okay.
Well, that could be why that might be why I tried to have a conversation with Axel. I had one interaction with Mr. Alonso after he was hired, and it didn't go well for me. I mean, I was told in no uncertain terms by Mr. Alonso that he was hired specifically for his Rolodex. He had been over at DC working on the what was the more adult line that they had there?
Vertigo?
Yes. So he had a Rolodex full of high-end, respected writers and artists that worked with him at Vertigo, and that he felt that that's why Marvel hired him, and that he had absolutely no interest in... I mean, he never used these words, but the impression I was definitely given was he had absolutely no interest in working with a has-been like myself. So I ended the conversation with absolutely no doubt that I was never going to get work from Axel Alonso, which turned out to be true, by the way. But, what are you going to do? So, yeah, we were at cross purposes, but it makes sense that would have been why I would have even approached him. It probably would have been in the aftermath of, helping out Ralph and hoping that might turn into more work and pursuing that possible option that led to Very difficult conversation. Anyway, difficult for me. I'm sure Axel Alonso doesn't even remember it. But anyway.
Just for clarity's sake, I did double check, and it looks like issue 27 is the first official Axel Alonso issue. So that does make sense that this is right during that end of Macchio's tenure. Yeah,
okay. It begins to all kind of tie together at that point. And maybe that had something to do with the disconnect between the anniversary issues. And I mean, I believe they were double-sized anniversary issues. Mm-hmm. With everything that happened with this miniseries at the 11th hour and everything, it might have been made difficult or impossible for Roger's plots to be provided to the other two writers. I don't know. I don't know. It's a mystery to this day, and but I do feel it was kind of a shame for the readers because there's not a lot of connection there.
It's interesting. I keep saying interesting. I should stop doing that. But it is of note that you guys worked under such fast turnarounds, and yet from a publication standpoint, it was coming out monthly. So I'm curious, I mean, was it just the first issue that was so far behind? And then...
I remember our mandate being that we needed to turn these books around very fast, all of them.
And I guess that makes sense if the idea was that those completed issues were going to be provided to the creative teams to understand where to pivot from. But again, now having looked at them, that does not seem to be the case. No.
There was very little or no pivoting happening at all. No pivot. It all, it didn't turn into more work with Ralph. It didn't play into the anniversary issues. I've never discussed it with Roger. I have no idea how he felt about it. I seem to remember, I have a stray memory that when we started to touch back on some of those stories in Spider-Girl, that I had a conversation with Roger where I mentioned, by the way, we're picking up on Colina and we're going to pick up on the programming and all that. And he just kind of laughed because, again, he's a veteran. I mean, he's been in the office as an editor, and he's been a veteran writer for decades and decades. So, I mean, this kind of stuff just kind of rolls off his back as the price you pay for periodical publication,
I do want to take note of some particular things that I really enjoyed. In the first issue, you start off with a great splash, which definitely felt like a classic Buscema punch. Was that intentional?
Actually, I think that kind of reads a little bit more like a Gil Kane punch, to tell you the truth. But
okay. Actually, no, you know what? When I look at it and I think about it now, I can see where you're coming from there.
Yeah, Gil Kane always had a way of making a punch look like a baseball pitcher, and I think that's kind of what we're leaning into a little bit there,
Oh yeah,
but
I can see that.
Yeah, and it's always fun to do, classic Spider-Man situations. The move in the pages that follow of him, jumping up onto the Green Goblin and putting him in the leg lock and on the headlock and everything. Just that's kind of stuff that I remember from the Stan Lee Gil Kane work in the late '60s, early '70s, and it was a lot of fun. I mean, anytime I get to do Spider-Man, it's a joy, no doubt about it.
A couple pages later, you do this shot where, again, it is a reference page, but in the top right hand of the page, you have Spider-Man's on a TV screen, and it just shows him kind of walking away from the action or walking away from the reporter and just saying, "No, I'm through." And there's just something about the way it's so simple, or deceptively simple, I should say, where you have Spider-Man walking away from the camera, but you can really feel the weight of that moment, and so it's a very, very understated but really brilliant piece of character acting that I wanted to take note of.
Okay, are you now? Is it possible that it's taken right from a Romita Jr. shot? Because it may be. I don't know. I mean, if you go back and look at the issue we're referencing, it might be, very much staged, very much the way Romita Jr. did it, because I don't know for sure. It's been too long since I've seen the reference, but you're right. I mean, all of this stuff is all working off of those prior issues and everything, The page before, there's a shot from The Gathering of Five, and, so it's incredibly possible. Even that, the shot of the newspaper with the team up with Thor and everything was all, things that would have been sent to me in reference by Roger.
Mm-hmm. Well, it is picking up off of what JRJR had done, but there is some subtle nuances that are different that I am really responding to.
Well, I appreciated that. Thank you very much. As always, I appreciate your insights. I mean, as I'm flipping through this, I have the trade paperback collection. As I'm flipping through this, I'm just impressed all over again by Pat Olive's work. His pen work and his brush work and his illustrative take on, what I might have thrown in as an indication for lighting and things like that. It's just wonderful. He's an incredibly talented man.
There's one thing I wanted to note. You have this page where Norman is reading a newspaper, he's talking to Kalina, and he remembers Emily. And so that first shot of Emily, I actually had to take a second. I'm like, because it really reminded me of Mayday later on. Just something about the kind of the musculature of the face. And it reminded me of some of, in your latter half of Spider-Girl, some of your female faces started to not change, but to evolve as you were drawing. And this felt like one of the first indications of that evolution.
Okay. It's possible that that if you're going to have my pencils and Pat's inks, and the character's hair is going to be of medium to short length, that it's going to be almost impossible for it not to remind you of Mayday. But
I guess that's
I'll
true.
go with that. And again, I'm trying to remember whether she had been shown before. I don't know whether Emily had been established. I don't know whether I was working off of reference or whether I just had to come up with something on the fly. To tell you the truth, I don't really remember. I might have been just dealing from the fact that Colina was supposed to be reminding him to a certain degree of Emily. But yeah, I mean, unfortunately, it's been long enough that I don't have real strong direct memories of some of this.
You're forgiven. It's been 24, 25 years, so you're forgiven for that. In the second issue, you have this shot of the Green Goblin, and he's wearing, like, ceremonial robes, and I really like that image. And I don't think that's a reference, because I don't think we'd ever seen him as the Goblin leading the Squires before. I think we'd always ever seen him as Norman doing it, so I really liked that interpretation with the robes on top.
Yeah, I was coming up with a lot of that on the fly. I don't believe there were some shots in the following pages that were pulled from some of the reference Roger sent me and everything. But those robes and even the half masks that the cult are wearing as the Scryers became the Goblin cult were all things that we kind of came up with on the fly. Probably coming off of Eyes Wide Shut or something like that at the time. But
I thought it was interesting how Roger used Donald Mencken, because I mean, Mencken made the most sense to kind of manipulate him in this way and have him be this, like, kind of devout follower of Norman. It's interesting because obviously I remember him from the classic Roger Stern stuff, but I also remember seeing him in Hobgoblin Lives because he was playing him up as potential identity for Hobgoblin.
Suspect.
A suspect there, and so it was interesting seeing him here and used kind of furthering, but he almost felt like he'd lost a bit of his spine, but it made sense because now Norman's back. This is the guy he really wants to toady up to, as opposed to anyone else. But it was interesting to kind of see how Roger wrote him. There is a sequence a few pages in after the one I just mentioned with the Goblin and the robes, where you do this great split panel of Norman's face. You have this, on the one half, it's Norman's face looking fairly disgusted, actually, and on the other half, it's more of the Goblin taking over in that part of his personality. I really liked your work on that split image.
Yeah, and I was a little surprised that the colorist brought it home as much as he did in the coloring. Going with the green. That wasn't necessarily my original intent to go that obvious with it. Matt Hicks did some really interesting stuff in very short order on this job. A lot of the coloring I thought was very impressive given the turnaround time. But that was something that, we were kind of going with something a little subtler with just the shadow in the eye and all that kind of stuff and the glint of the eye. And he went full bore with the green coloring and all that kind of stuff to say, okay, well, there's no point in being subtle in a comic book necessarily.
There's a dream sequence later on in the second issue where this is when Peter's starting to realize something's wrong, or he doesn't realize something's wrong necessarily, but things are going wrong in his dream, and you have him talking to Uncle Ben and Norman. And first of all, the Uncle Ben feels obviously right out of a Ditko page. It looks great, especially with certain little intonations in the face. But even Osborn's face feels like it's hewing more to a Romita style in that particular sequence. And I guess maybe it's because it's a dream sequence and because it kind of has a more of an old school throwback mentality. Was that very deliberate?
Not that I can remember. Norman we kind of went with the last few times he had been handled, and I was working a little too fast to worry about subtleties of influences and all that kind of stuff. Norman's face just became pretty set for me fairly early on as being a little beefier and all that kind of stuff. I had never really handled Norman much. There was an annual I had done that was inked by Romita Sr. And everything, and I tended to, probably favor Romita's treatment of Norman because he probably did him more than Ditko, really, because Norman was only introduced towards the end of Ditko's run. So it's not like I always, go back to Ditko's few panels of Norman to do Norman or anything. So we were kind of working a little too fast to indulge too much reverential reference of that type. So it probably was just the easiest Norman I could come up with at the time. I mean, as I flip through this, I do see some stuff that, some facial proportions and everything that aren't as consistent as I would have liked if I would have had, time to think about it. But, overall, like I said, between Pat's inking and the coloring, I mean, I think it certainly serves Roger's story as well as it could, given the limitations. But I mean, overall, we survived.
It's interesting on a reread without the context, and again, not remembering necessarily what came afterwards when I was rereading it. When you get to the end of issue 2, and Colina has inhaled the goblin, or not the goblin, but the gas the goblin's thrown at her. I for a moment was like, is she dead? Like that's which I guess obviously was the point. You do a great job really capturing the anguish of Norman and trying to confront his own feelings and how he feels about things, because we've only ever really seen him be a bad guy, and this is really the first time that we ever saw a different side of Norman as not just being evil, and so actually having a different side to him, because by the time writers started writing kind of could have written him with more nuance, it was kind of past the point of no return for him. So it was interesting to see you guys develop him differently and give him a love interest, and then seeing the anguish on his face. You do feel that because you really sell it.
Well, thank you. I mean, that's, it's, I mean, comics are melodrama. And, that's one of the things that Sal Buscema is so really good at, that Romita was so really good at, that, and those are the guys that I studied and learned from and, do my best to emulate. So, yeah, I thank you very much. But it's very broad strokes. It's very melodramatic facial responses, things like that. So yeah, and as far as I've always myself been a little confused by Norman Osborn because originally it was this thing where he had a split personality and he didn't remember he didn't remember being the Goblin when he was Norman Osborn, and that's those are the stories that I read when I was younger and everything, and then it kind of became this. Norman's just generally an evil guy, and they kind of got rid of the split personality stuff and, because it had kind of become old hat. And frankly, I think Roger did one of the better jobs of fusing those two takes on the character together. And I believe DeMatteis was also behind one of the annuals that was referenced heavily. It was probably DeMatteis, but I'm not sure, because he was always very good at doing these character studies, where they went into Norman's childhood, and Roger touches on it in this miniseries, how completely screwed up that poor kid was, and passed it on down to his kid, Harry, and all this kind of stuff, that it wasn't, that he wasn't just this always, he wasn't this incredibly stable businessman until he had the accident with the with the explosion that turned him into the Green Goblin and stuff. That it really was more psychologically messy. That we kind of became more comfortable with that kind of storytelling and everything. And yeah, I agree with you. I mean, it's always been something. Even though I was raised on comic books and good guys and bad guys and all that kind of stuff, I've always balked at the idea of it's just pure evil. When something bad happens, it's just pure evil. And it's not. It's always about our damage. It's always about somebody's damage. Their behavior is all based on something. And very rarely, if ever, does it have anything to do with somebody just rubbing their two hands together and going, and being evil. It goes back to the bad guys never see themselves as the bad guys, that kind of thing. And good characters always need to be well drawn and you have to get inside their motivations, why they feel the way they feel, why they do the things they do. And that's one of the things I was really sorry to see be wasted, is all of Roger's work in these 3 issues tell us who Norman Osborn is, because, he's a tragic character. He's the star of the miniseries. I mean, Pete's a supporting character in this whole thing, Pete's a victim of his master plan, but it's really a miniseries about Norman Osborn, and I kind of embraced that early on when I, got familiar with Norman's meaty face and all that kind of stuff. I it's okay, we're going to tell his story, and it wasn't real superhero involved and everything, and I was relying heavily on knowing that Pat's this incredibly well-rounded illustrator that was going to be able to flesh out what I was laying down on the page in pencil and everything, and it all kind of worked out. It all kind of fell together. So.
Well, again, I always thank you for coming back on the show and talking about your work, and every time I pull something off my shelf and I'm like, oh man, I haven't talked to Ron about this yet. So it's a nice study in finding what other things can I talk to Ron about.
And I appreciate the fact that you think about me at all, Adam. Believe me. And again, it's great fun for me to revisit these projects because I've been a very, very lucky guy. To work with Roger Stern, to work with Pat Olive, to work with Ralph Macchio, and to work on these characters and contribute some little bit to the histories of these characters and everything. It's been a blessing, and I'm just a very, very, very lucky guy. So thank you very much for the opportunity to discuss this stuff.
It's funny, as we move forward in your kind of personal chronology or bibliography, I feel like, maybe at some point we'll talk about the Buzz and Dark Devil, because I remember buying those off the stands when they were coming out, and I would love to talk about those with you.
Well, that'd be my pleasure, sir. Those are characters that are all very near and dear to me, since I played a direct hand in developing them and designing them and all that kind of stuff. So anytime you're ready, you just let me know. All right, Adam?
It's going to happen sooner than you realize.
Okay. Continued success to you, sir. I'm glad you're back podcasting.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you so much for being back, and we'll chat soon.
All right. You take care of yourself, sir. Have a good night.